The Little Bird Café in the French Quarter of New Orleans was nearly empty that Tuesday afternoon in March. The golden yellow walls of the colonial mansion contrasted with the faded mosaic tiles worn by time, creating a nostalgic atmosphere that Emily Wilson had come to love over the past 5 years. The 27-year-old, with her golden blonde hair tied in a messy bun and blue eyes that reflected both exhaustion and determination, cleaned the rustic wooden tables for the 3rd time since lunch. Her fair skin was slightly flushed from the Louisiana heat that infiltrated through the open windows, and small beads of sweat shimmered on her forehead as she rearranged the woven straw chairs that her boss had purchased from a local artisan. The aroma of freshly roasted coffee mingled with the smell of fried seafood coming from the street, where vendors offered po' boys to tourists exploring the historic center. Emily liked this time of day, when business slowed down and she could contemplate the view of the Mississippi River through the window that faced the terrace. It was during these hours that she dreamed of a different future, perhaps opening her own business, something that would combine her passion for coffee with her desire to help the community. Suddenly, the glass door opened, with a tinkling of brass bells hanging on the jamb, interrupting her daydreams. A man entered like a silent storm, bringing with him a disturbing energy that made the air around seem denser. Richard Blackwood, 33 years old, tall and imposing at 6'1", wore an impeccable navy blue Italian suit that contrasted drastically with the casual atmosphere of the cafe. His blonde hair was perfectly combed back, revealing a high forehead and penetrating green eyes that scanned the environment with a critical and disapproving look, as if every detail of the place was a personal offense. His English leather shoes shone so brightly they reflected the yellowish light from the wrought iron chandeliers. He carried an aura of authority and coldness that made the other 2 clients in the cafe, 2 elderly ladies playing dominoes while sipping café au lait, look in his direction with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. Richard seemed oblivious to the looks, his fingers impatiently tapping on the counter while waiting to be served. Emily approached with her characteristic smile, one that had won over even the most difficult customers during her years in customer service. It was a smile that was born from the eyes, genuine and warm, the result of an upbringing that valued kindness above all else. "Good afternoon. Welcome to the Little Bird Café. How can I help you? If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video so you don't miss the next incredible narratives we've prepared for you. And hey, what city are you watching from? Leave it in the comments. We love knowing where our listeners are. Now let's continue our story." Richard looked her up and down, as if evaluating defective merchandise in a department store. His green eyes studied her with a calculating coldness that made Emily feel exposed, vulnerable. "Coffee, espresso, and I hope it's better than the appearance of this place suggests," he said, his deep voice carrying an accent that blended New York with overseas education. The words cut through the air like a sharp blade. Emily felt her cheeks flush, an automatic reaction that always betrayed her when she felt embarrassed, but maintained her smile with a willpower she had developed over the years. "Of course, sir. Our coffee is special. Selected beans from the Pacific Northwest. They're roasted right here every morning. I'm sure you'll love it." "Doubtfully," he muttered, choosing a table in the most remote corner of the cafe, away from the entrance and other customers. His movements were precise, economical, like those of someone accustomed to conserving gestures and words. Emily went to the counter, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared the coffee. The Italian espresso machine, which had been her boss's pride when he bought it used 5 years ago, hissed and released steam as she ground the fresh beans. The intense smell of coffee momentarily reassured her. It was an aroma she always associated with better mornings, with hope. She knew this type of customer well. She had worked in that cafe since her parents died in a car accident on Highway 90, leaving her responsible for taking care of her younger sister Sophie. Every humiliation, every acidic comment, every look of contempt was swallowed in silence because she desperately needed the job. When she returned with the white porcelain cup on a delicate saucer, she gently placed it on the dark wooden table. The steam rose in delicate spirals, carrying the rich aroma of beans roasted at the perfect temperature. "Here you are, sir. Can I bring you anything to accompany it? We have a delicious blueberry cobbler, a family recipe from Mrs. Robin, who gives the cafe its name. It's made with fresh blueberries picked that morning and homemade vanilla cream." "No." The response was dry, cutting, said without him even looking at her. His eyes were fixed on the window, observing the movement of the street with an expression of boredom mixed with irritation. Emily backed away a few steps, but something in her kind nature, a trait she had inherited from her mother, a woman who could never pass someone in need without offering help, made her try again. "If you need anything, I'll be over at the counter." Her voice maintained the same cordiality, despite the knot she felt in her throat. Richard took a sip of the coffee and, to his own surprise, found an exceptional flavor. Rich, full-bodied, with notes of Belgian chocolate and caramel that danced on his demanding palate, accustomed to the world's best coffees. It was better than many espressos he had taken in Parisian or Milanese cafes. For a moment, his hardened expression softened, but he quickly recomposed the mask of coldness he had worn as armor for so many years. 3 days later, on a grey Friday that threatened rain, Richard returned. This time Emily noticed that he arrived at exactly the same time, 3:23 p.m., and that he seemed more observant, his green eyes scanning every detail of the cafe as if memorizing the place, cataloguing each imperfection, each rustic charm. She approached with the same gentleness as always, despite the bitter memory of their first encounter. "Good afternoon again. The usual?" Her voice carried a forced but genuine joy in its essence. For the first time he looked her directly in the eyes. It was an intense, penetrating look that seemed to want to unravel the deepest secrets of her soul. For a brief instant, Emily saw something different in those green eyes, a vulnerability, a deep sadness that he quickly hid behind his arrogant facade, like someone closing a heavy curtain to prevent light from entering. "Yes, and this. At time, bring that blueberry cobbler." The order came with a less aggressive tone, almost curious. "Excellent choice." Emily smiled genuinely, and it was as if the sun appeared through the heavy clouds. "It's my grandmother Martha's recipe from rural Louisiana. She used to say that each piece carries a bit of a mother's love." As she prepared the order, carefully grinding the beans and cutting a generous slice of the cobbler she had made that morning before work, she felt his eyes on her. There was something hypnotizing about the way he watched her, as if trying to decipher a complex enigma, solve an equation he had never encountered before. When she returned with the steaming coffee and the cobbler decorated with fresh berries, he continued to stare at her with that disturbing intensity. "Have you worked here long?" The question surprised her as much for breaking the silence as for the almost human tone he used. 5 years, she replied, arranging the cup and checking if there were enough napkins on the table. "Since I finished high school, I started here as a kitchen helper and worked my way up." "And do you plan to stay here forever, serving coffee to strangers?" The question had a mocking tone that made Emily stiffen, her shoulders automatically tensing. "This job gives me dignity, sir. I support my family with it." There was a firmness in her voice that surprised even herself. Richard chewed a piece of the cobbler, savoring the perfect mix of textures, the fresh berries, the soft dough, the sweetness just right. It was, in fact, exceptional. "Family?" There was genuine curiosity in his question. "My younger sister, Sophie. She's at university studying medicine at Tulane." There was uncontained pride in her voice, her eyes shining with fraternal love. "On a waitress's salary?" The skepticism was evident, almost cruel in its simplicity. Emily felt a wave of irritation course through her body. "I work 2 jobs, sir. Mornings here, evenings at a diner in the Garden District. I clean houses in the weekends in Uptown. I do whatever it takes to see my sister succeed." Something changed in Richard's face at that moment. A shadow of something that could be admiration, or perhaps recognition, crossed his aristocratic features, but disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, like a reflection of light in a puddle of water. Richard's visits became as regular as the tides of the Mississippi River, every Tuesday and Thursday, always at the same time, 3:23 p.m. sharp, always at the same corner table, always with the same silent ritual. Emily began to prepare his coffee before he even arrived, knowing exactly how he liked it. Strong, without sugar, accompanied by a glass of cold water and a small slice of lemon that he never used, but that she insisted on bringing. "You're very predictable," she commented on one of those April afternoons as the golden autumn afternoon infiltrated through the colonial windows, creating a play of light and shadow on the tables. She placed his usual order on the table with a fluid movement developed through practice. "Predictability is efficiency," he replied, but there was a softer tone in his voice, an almost imperceptible break in the wall he had built around himself. "Or boredom," retorted Emily, with a playful smile that made her blue eyes dance. It was a smile that completely transformed her face, revealing the young and vibrant woman who was hiding behind the professional facade. To his own surprise, Richard almost smiled. Almost. The corners of his mouth contracted slightly in an expression he hadn't used in years. "Have you always been so direct? My parents used to say I was born without a filter between my brain and my mouth." She laughed, a crystalline laugh that echoed through the nearly empty cafe. "Sometimes it gets me in trouble, but at least I'm honest. My mom used to say that a lie has short legs, but truth has a strong heart. And if you're enjoying our story so far, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We want to know, what would you do if you were Emily? Would you be so kind to someone who seems so arrogant at first? Tell us in the comments. We love interacting with you." Richard observed her for a long moment, studying every nuance of her expression. "Honesty is a rare quality these days," he said, almost to himself. "Maybe you're not hanging out with the right people," suggested Emily, tilting her head in an expression that mixed understanding and challenge. "New Orleans is full of good people, with hearts as open as the mighty Mississippi. You just need to know where to look." "And where do you suggest I look?" There was genuine curiosity in his question, as if he really wanted to know the answer. Emily gestured around with a broad movement of her arms. "Right here, in the French Quarter, at the Jackson Square Market, where the locals sell their homemade jams and pralines. On the beach at Lake Pontchartrain when the sun sets and paints the sky orange and pink. At the French Market, where each artisan has a story to tell. The best people are those who don't try to be special, they simply are." Richard remained silent, processing her words as if they were pieces of a puzzle he was trying to put together. For weeks, he had tested Emily in various subtle ways, being deliberately rude, leaving ridiculously small tips only to leave excessively large amounts later, making sarcastic comments about the coffee, the environment, even the simple decoration of the place. On all occasions, she maintained the same genuine kindness, the same infinite patience, as if each insult ricocheted off an invisible armor made of pure goodness. "Why don't you ask me what I do for a living?" he questioned, leaning slightly forward in a more intimate posture. Emily shrugged, a simple gesture that carried surprising wisdom. "Because it doesn't matter. You're just the gentleman who has coffee here on Tuesdays and Thursdays. If you wanted me to know more, you would tell me. Everyone carries their secrets, and I respect that." This response deeply shocked him. In his world, A universe of corporations, investments, and business where every conversation was a potential negotiation. Everyone wanted to know who he was, what he owned, how much he was worth, what he could offer, what doors he could open. Emily was the first person in years who seemed genuinely disinterested in his resources, his position, his power. It was like finding pure water in the midst of a desert of self-interested relationships. It was on a particularly torrential, rainy afternoon, typical of New Orleans, when the sky opens like a floodgate and water descends in furious cascades down the streets of the French Quarter, that everything changed between them. Richard had arrived at the cafe soaking wet, his perfectly combed blonde hair now stuck to his forehead, his navy blue Italian suit darkened by water, drops running down his broad shoulders. He looked like a dethroned prince, an almost comical figure in his ruined elegance. Emily ran to him as soon as she saw him enter, her blue eyes reflecting genuine concern. "Good heavens, you're soaked to the bone." She disappeared for a moment to the back of the cafe and returned with a clean, fluffy towel, still warm from the dryer. Without asking permission, she began to dry his shoulders with caring, maternal movements, her small hands working with a delicacy that contrasted with the urgency of the situation. Richard was paralyzed, like a marble statue in the rain. For years, more years than he would like to admit, no one had cared for him that way. His mother had died when he was only 9 years old, victim of an aggressive cancer that no money could cure. His father, August Blackwood, a ruthless businessman, had never shown physical affection, seeing any gesture of care as a sign of weakness. The sensation of Emily's hands through the soft towel, the smell of her subtle perfume mixed with the aroma of coffee, the genuine care in each movement, all of this made him close his eyes for a moment and simply feel. I'll get you a hot coffee," she murmured, suddenly aware of the intimacy of the gesture, of how close she had come to him, of how she could feel the warmth of his body through the wet shirt. "Richard," he said softly, his voice carrying a vulnerability that he rarely allowed others to see. "My name is Richard. Richard Blackwood." "Richard," she repeated, and the name sounded different on her lips, softer, more human. "I'm Emily Wilson, but you already knew that, didn't you?" He smiled, a real smile this time, one that completely transformed his face, revealing the man behind the mask. "Hello, Emily Wilson." That day, they talked for hours, while the rain drummed against the windows like impatient fingers. The cafe emptied completely, but neither of them seemed to notice. Richard told her about the constant pressure of always having to prove his worth, not for who he was, but for the name he carried. He talked about the loneliness of his penthouse apartment in Uptown, with a view of the river but empty of laughter, about how he never knew if people liked him or his social position, his money, his connections. Each word came out as if it were being extracted from a deep and painful place that he rarely visited. Emily talked about her dreams of one day having her own business, something that would combine her passion for coffee with her desire to make a difference in the community. She told him how she admired Sophie's iron determination, who studied until the early hours of the morning under the weak light of an old lamp because they didn't have money to replace it. She talked about the longing for her parents that never left her, especially on important dates, when their absence became almost physical. "You know what I love most about New Orleans?" said Emily, looking out the window where the rain was beginning to diminish, leaving the air fresher and perfumed. "It's that here everyone has a story. The fisherman from Lake Pontchartrain, the vendor who sells beignets in Jackson Square, the artisan who makes sculptures in the French market. And all these stories matter, you know. They all are part of something bigger." Richard watched her speak, hypnotized by the passion in her voice. He noticed how her blue eyes sparkled when she was excited, how her hands gesticulated expressively painting. Images in the air, how her smile was capable of illuminating not only the cafe, but apparently the entire rainy afternoon. "You have a very romantic view of the world," he commented, but there was affection in his observation, not mockery. "And you have a very cynical view," she retorted without hesitation. "Reality must be somewhere in the middle, don't you think?" The weeks that followed were the most confusing and intense of Emily's life. Richard continued to visit the cafe religiously, but now there was a palpable tension in the air, as thick as the steam that rose from the hot cups. He was sometimes gentle and attentive, asking about her day, listening carefully to her stories about customers, genuinely smiling at her silly jokes, sometimes becoming cold and distant, almost hostile, as if an inner storm consumed him. She felt as if she were dancing a complicated waltz where she didn't know the steps, and her partner constantly changed the rhythm. It was like living on an emotional roller coaster. One afternoon, he would arrive with flowers, white daisies he said he had seen in a florist shop, and reminded him of her smile. On the next visit, he would barely look in her direction, responding to her attempts at conversation with cutting monosyllables. Emily began to question whether she was imagining the connection between them, if perhaps it was just a projection of her emotional neediness onto a complex male figure. On a particularly tense May afternoon, Richard arrived, visibly shaken. He was coming from a devastating meeting where he had to authorize the dismissal of 200 employees from a company his corporation had acquired. Each face in the report represented a family, an interrupted dream, a life turned upside down. The weight of decisions that affected hundreds of families crushed him like a hydraulic press, and he felt like a monster dressed in a suit. "The usual?" asked Emily, immediately noticing his somber expression, the tense lines around his green eyes, the way his shoulders seemed to carry the world. "Don't you get tired?" The question came out more aggressive than he intended, loaded with all the bitterness and anger he felt for himself. "Of what?" Emily stopped halfway to the counter, sensing something dangerous in the air. "Of pretending you care, of smiling at everyone as if the world were a wonderful place, of being like this." He laughed bitterly, a sound that cut through the air like broken glass. Emily felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. Like what? Kind, sweet, naive, as if people weren't capable of evil, as if kindness was something that really mattered. His words came out like projectiles, each one loaded with years of disappointment and cynicism. "Don't you realize? People only use you. I myself, He stopped abruptly, realizing he was about to reveal too much. "You what?" Emily's voice was low, dangerous, loaded with a pain that he immediately recognized. Richard rose abruptly, knocking over the chair. "Nothing. Forget it, forget everything." But Emily had heard enough. Years of work in customer service, of reading between the lines of gestures and words, had taught her to decipher people like reading an open book. And finally, she was seeing Richard with crystal clarity. "You've been testing me," she said, her voice trembling not with fear, but with deep indignation. "All this time, all these visits, all this closeness. You were testing me as if I were a toy, an experiment." "Emily, it's not quite like that." He tried to approach, but she backed away, as if he were radioactive. "Yes, it is." Her voice rose an octave, attracting alarmed looks from the few clients in the cafe. "You thought you could play with me, see how far my patience would go, find out if I was genuine enough to deserve your real attention." Tears began to roll down her face, but her voice remained as firm as rock. "I work hard, Mr. Blackwood. I treat each person with respect, because that's how I was raised, not because I want something in return." The use of his surname was like a slap. She continued, each word a sure stab. "You know what your problem is? You're so used to fake people that you don't recognize sincerity when it sits in front of you every day. You're so afraid of being used that you prefer to use others first. Richard tried to approach again, hands extended in a mute plea. Emily, please let me explain. No. She raised her hand like a shield. You've already done your test. You've done your experiments. I hope you got all the answers you wanted. She turned to leave, but stopped and looked over her shoulder. And for your information, Mr. Blackwood, I knew you weren't an ordinary man from the first time you walked in here. $1,000 shoes, Swiss watch, posture of someone who commands and orders. But I chose to treat you like people because that's what you are. People. Pity you can't do the same with me. And she ran to the back of the cafe, leaving Richard standing there like a castaway amid the wreckage of a ship. Some clients looked at him with open disapproval. He placed $100 bill on the table, much more than the value of the bill, and went out walking awkwardly in the rain that had started to fall again, each drop like a tear from the sky. 3 weeks passed, like 3 years. The Little Bird Cafe continued its routine, but there was a palpable void where the disturbing presence of Richard had once been. Emily tried not to think about him, diving into work with an almost desperate intensity, but found herself looking at the door every Tuesday and Thursday, especially at 3:23 p.m. It was as if part of her routine had been brutally torn away, leaving a wound that refused to heal. Sophie immediately noticed her sister's melancholy during one of her weekly visits. The 22-year-old, with her curly blonde hair inherited from her mother and blue eyes identical to Emily's, had the same sharp intuition that ran in the family. She appeared at the cafe on a Saturday afternoon, carrying anatomy books and a worried expression. "Sis, you've been really strange, sadder than normal," she said, sitting at one of the tables and watching Emily compulsively organize the counter for the 5th time. "Did something happen at the cafe?" "It's nothing, Soph, just an annoying customer who finally stopped showing up." Emily tried to sound casual, but her voice betrayed the pain she felt. Sophie, despite being young, had a wisdom that came from having grown up too fast after her parents' death. "Must have been quite annoying to affect you like this. You look like someone who missed the last bus home." Emily stopped what she was doing and leaned against the counter, sighing deeply. "I think I deluded myself, you know. I thought I had found someone different, someone who saw beyond the waitress, the simple woman from the suburbs. But in the end, I was just a test, a psychological experiment. Did he hurt you?" Sophie's voice had a dangerous edge that reminded of their mother when someone messed with her daughters. "Not physically, but yes, he hurt me." Emily touched her chest, over her heart. "In here, where it hurts most." On a rainy Thursday, exactly a month after the explosive argument, Richard appeared. Emily saw him through the window before he entered, and her heart raced like a frightened horse. He was different, thinner, with deep circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, wearing worn jeans and a simple white shirt instead of his impeccable suits. He seemed smaller somehow, less imposing, as if he had left his armor at home. He approached the counter where she was polishing glasses with mechanical, nervous movements. "Emily, Mr. Blackwood." Her voice was formal, distant, but he didn't miss the slight tremor that betrayed her. Can I sit for a minute?" There was a humility in his voice that she had never heard before. She hesitated, then nodded. To an empty table, not his usual one, but one in the center of the cafe, under the direct light of the chandelier. They sat in silence for a moment that seemed to stretch for hours. The cafe was almost empty. Just an elderly lady in the corner reading a newspaper and sipping chamomile tea. "I came to say goodbye," he said finally, his nervous hands drumming on the wooden table, "and to apologize. Not just apologize, to ask for forgiveness, on my knees if necessary." Emily didn't answer, just waited, her blue eyes studying every nuance of his expression. There was something different about him, a raw vulnerability she had never seen before. You were right about everything, absolutely everything. He took a deep breath, as if preparing to dive into deep waters. My full name is Richard Blackwood. I'm the CEO of Blackwood Holdings, one of the largest investment corporations in the country. I inherited the company when my father died 2 years ago. Emily's eyes widened slightly. She knew that name. There wasn't an American who didn't know it. Blackwood Holdings was in everything: banks, construction companies, agribusiness, technology. It was an empire that moved billions. I'm used to people who want me for what I represent, for what I can offer: money, status, connections, doors I can open. His voice carried years of accumulated bitterness. When I found you, when I saw how you treated me without knowing who I was, I needed to be sure it was real, that your kindness wasn't calculated. And did you find what you wanted? Her voice was as cold as the south wind that blew from the river. I found that I'm an idiot, he said simply, without trying to justify himself. I found that I met the most genuine, purest person I've ever known in life, and almost lost her because of paranoia and distrust. I found that I am a product of a sick world where even love is a commercial transaction. He placed a craft envelope on the table, his hands imperceptibly trembling. This is not payment or compensation. It's not an excuse or a bargain. It's gratitude. Gratitude for showing me that genuine goodness still exists in the world, that there are still people who are worth more than all the gold in the world, for teaching me that the real value of a person is not in what they have, but in who they are, in what they do for others. Emily looked at the envelope without touching it, as if it were radioactive. I don't want your money, Mr. Blackwood. I know. That's exactly why you deserve it. He rose slowly, each movement loaded with weight. Use it as you wish. Donate it, burn it, tear it into little pieces. Throw it in the river if that's your will. Just know that someone who spent his entire life doubting people, building walls instead of bridges, learned to believe again because of you. He walked to the door, but stopped before leaving. Emily, you once asked me why I didn't tell you about my life. The truth is that I was afraid. Afraid that, knowing who I am, you would start treating me differently, that your smile would become calculated, that your words would become heavy with ulterior motives. He turned to look at her one last time. Ironically, it was my distrust that destroyed the only real thing that happened in my life in years. And he left, leaving Emily alone with the envelope and the sound of rain against the windows. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope. Inside, there was a check from the National Bank for $1 million, and a handwritten letter in an elegant calligraphy. Emily, you passed my patience test, but it was my heart that failed miserably. This tip doesn't pay even a fraction of what I learned from you, that true wealth lies in honesty, compassion, the ability to see beauty where others see only the ordinary. Thank you for showing me who I would like to be, who I can become if I have enough courage. I'm sorry for not being honest from the beginning. I'm sorry for having tested what I should have simply accepted. You taught me that love is not measured by what one receives, but by what one is willing to give without expecting anything in return. Richard. Emily read the letter 3 times before the words really registered in her mind. $1 million, an amount that would change her life, that would allow Sophie to graduate without difficulties, that would fulfill all her dreams. But along with the euphoria came anger, the feeling of betrayal, the question of whether this gesture was genuine or just another sophisticated manipulation. Sophie's cafe was busy on a sunny Saturday morning. Located in a carefully restored colonial mansion in the Garden District, it was much more than a coffee shop. It had become a community cultural center that breathed new life into those century-old walls. The reclaimed wood tables contrasted with colorful chairs painted by local artists. Young people from the region worked as baristas, waiters and cooks, all uniformed with hand-embroidered aprons made by a women's cooperative from the community. There was a small library in the back with shelves made from market crates and books donated by the community. Literacy classes operated at night, and on the walls, works by local artists were exhibited and sold, with 70% of the value going to the artist. It was exactly as Emily had dreamed, a place that served exceptional coffee, but also nurtured dreams, built bridges, transformed lives. Emily, now co-owner of the establishment, along with Sophie, who continued her medical studies but helped with management, was checking the tables when she saw a familiar figure hesitating at the entrance. Richard was there, but he wasn't the same arrogant man from months ago, nor the broken man who had said goodbye on that rainy afternoon. He wore casual clothes, faded jeans and a white cotton shirt. He carried a book under his arm, and there was a genuine simplicity in his posture that she had never seen before. Their eyes met across the busy hall, and for a moment the world seemed to pause. Then slowly, like someone testing thin ice on a lake, he approached. "Can I order a coffee?" His voice carried a nervousness that reminded her of the boy he must have been before building all those walls. Emily studied his face minutely, looking for signs of the mask he used to wear, of the psychological games, of the subtle manipulation. She found none. There was just a man who seemed genuinely sorry and hopeful. "How about our house special? Coffee with coconut milk and a blueberry muffin." Her voice was professional but not cold, cautious but not hostile. "Perfect." The smile that spread across his face was shy, almost adolescent. She prepared the order personally, her hands steadier now, secure in her own territory. When she returned, he was leafing through a book of poems by Walt Whitman that he had taken from the community library. "American literature?" she commented, placing the coffee on the table with fluid movements. "I'm trying to better understand this city, these people." He looked at her with eyes that no longer hid anything. "You were right. New Orleans is full of extraordinary people. And how did you discover that?" There was genuine curiosity in her question. "Volunteer work in the 9th Ward community, free consulting for micro-entrepreneurs, financing social projects without seeking profit or publicity." He took a sip of the coffee and smiled with genuine surprise. "Your recipe? An adaptation of my grandfather Joseph's recipe. He used to say that good coffee is like true friendship. It takes time to find, but when you find it, it warms you inside and accompanies you throughout life." Richard laughed softly, and it was a completely different sound from what she was used to. "Your grandfather was a wise man." They talked for over an hour. Emily told him about the cafe's projects, about how she was using only part of the money from the tip, creating a fund that benefited young people from the community. She talked about how Sophie was standing out even more in college, now that she didn't have to worry about money, but maintained the values they had learned together. About how discovering that true generosity wasn't about giving everything, but giving in a way that really made a difference. Richard talked about the dramatic changes in his company, about how he was implementing real social responsibility policies, not just green marketing. He told her about the nights he spent awake thinking about the families of the employees he had fired, about how he was trying to repair some damage, rehiring those he could, helping those he couldn't, about how he was learning that true power wasn't about controlling people, but about empowering them. "Emily," he said as he was preparing to leave, hesitating as if the next words were the most important of his life. "I would like, that is, if you allow, to come back tomorrow, not as the CEO of Blackwood Holdings, not as the man who can write million-dollar checks, but as Richard, just Richard, a man who would like to get to know an extraordinary woman better if she gives him a second chance." She studied him for a long moment. There was sincerity in his green eyes, a vulnerability that he no longer tried to hide behind masks or games. But more importantly, there was growth. He was no longer the broken and cynical man who had left in the rain months ago, nor the arrogant aristocrat who had entered her life like a storm. He was someone new, someone who had chosen to transform himself. "Tomorrow we also serve the house special," she finally said, a small smile playing on her lips. "And on Thursdays we have live music, jazz with the masters from Basin Street. Then until tomorrow, Emily." He rose, but paused. "And Emily, thank you for teaching me that second chances aren't given, they're earned. Until tomorrow, Richard." As he walked away, Emily thought of her grandmother, Martha, who always said that true love didn't arrive like a tropical storm, but like a gentle tide, slowly, constantly, filling all the empty spaces without hurry, but with absolute certainty of its destination. Perhaps, just perhaps, it was time to let the tide rise. Sophie appeared at her side, following her sister's gaze through the window where Richard walked down the sunny street. "Who is that? And why are you smiling like that, like a lovesick fool?" "Someone who is learning that not every—" "A tip is paid with money," replied Emily, smiling. "Some are paid with genuine transformation." "And you? What are you learning?" Emily looked around the cafe she had built, saw her employees smiling while serving customers, heard the laughter of children playing in the small garden they had created in the courtyard, felt the love that pulsed in that place like soft music. "I'm learning that forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's choosing to believe that people can be better than they were. And that, sometimes, when we give someone a second chance, we're giving ourselves a first chance." 1 year later, the first anniversary of Sophie's Cafe was being celebrated with a party that transformed the entire street in the Garden District into an extension of the establishment. Colourful banners stretched from one veranda to another, musicians played jazz on the sidewalk, and the aroma of specialty coffee mingled with the smell of beignets, cornbread, and homemade pies that neighbours had brought to share. Emily circulated among the guests like a natural hostess, her blonde hair now longer, tied in a side braid, decorated with white jasmine that Richard had brought from the garden of his new home. A simple house in Lakeview, far from the luxury apartments of Uptown. She wore a light blue dress that enhanced her eyes, and there was a lightness in her movements that spoke of realized dreams and genuine happiness. The cafe had become more than a thriving business. It was a symbol of transformation for the entire community. The library in the back now occupied 2 floors with more than 5,000 donated books. The literacy project served 40 adults per week. 6 young people from the region had received full scholarships through the educational fund that Emily had created. And most importantly, 3 relationships had been born there, including a wedding scheduled for the following month between one of the employees and a regular customer. Richard observed Emily from afar, leaning on the counter where everything had begun exactly 1 year and 2 months ago. He was unrecognizable, tanned by the Louisiana sun, wearing a white guayabera and beige linen pants, his hair slightly disheveled by the sea breeze. His green eyes shone with a peace he hadn't known since childhood. In his hands he held a small package that he had been keeping for weeks, waiting for the right moment. Sophie approached him, carrying a tray with gourmet pralines that she had made herself. At 23, she was in her penultimate year of medical school, interning at Tulane Medical Center, but always found time to help at the cafe. "Nervous?" she asked with a mischievous smile. "That transparent?" Richard laughed, running his hand through his hair in a gesture that revealed his anxiety. "A man in love is like a lighthouse. Everyone can see it from far away." Sophie laughed. "But can I tell you something? I've never seen my sister so happy. She sings in the shower now. Emily never sang in the shower, not even as a child. She saved me, Sophie, literally saved me." His voice carried a deep gratitude. I was drowning in a world of cynicism and distrust, and she threw me a lifeline. You saved each other, Sophie wisely corrected. She was drowning in responsibilities and fears, and you showed her that dreaming big wasn't foolishness. It was necessary. The music stopped, and Mr. Anthony, the jazz master from the Trem neighborhood who had become a regular at the cafe, called everyone's attention by tapping on his trumpet. Attention, folks, our dear Emily is going to speak. Emily climbed onto a chair, blushing slightly with all the attention directed at her. Dear people, she began, her voice carrying the emotion of the moment. A year ago, I couldn't imagine that I would be here, surrounded by so many good people, celebrating not just a cafe, but a community, a family. Spontaneous applause echoed down the street. She waited for silence to return. I want to thank each one of you who believed in this dream when it was just a crazy idea in the heads of two orphaned sisters from the suburbs. You transformed this place into a little piece of heaven here on earth. Her eyes searched for Richard in the crowd. When they found him, she smiled in a way that made his heart race as if it were the first time. I especially want to thank someone who came into my life like a storm and stayed like a gentle breeze. Someone who taught me that second chances are sometimes better than first chances. Richard approached slowly, the small package in his hands. The crowd naturally opened a path as if they knew something special was about to happen. When he reached her, he helped her down from the chair, his hands lingering on her arms for a moment. Emily, he said, his voice clear enough for everyone to hear. A year and 2 months ago, I entered this cafe as a lost man, grumpy, embittered by the world. You served me coffee, but you gave me much more than that. You gave me hope. You gave me purpose. You gave me love when I didn't even know how to receive it anymore. He knelt right there, in front of everyone, taking a small box from the package. The crowd let out collective sighs. Emily brought her hands to her face, tears already beginning to spring forth. You transformed me into the best version of myself. You taught me that true wealth isn't counted in numbers in a bank account, but in shared smiles, in lives touched, in multiplied love. He opened the box, revealing a simple white gold ring with a small emerald, the stone of hope he had researched. Emily Wilson, will you marry me? Not the CEO, not the businessman, but me, the Richard you helped to be born. The silence lasted only a second before Emily fell to her knees in front of him, taking his face in her hands. Yes, 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 1,000 times yes. And she kissed him right there, in front of everyone, while the street exploded in applause, shouts of joy and trumpets that started playing again. Mr. Anthony began a song that all of New Orleans knew, When the Saints Go Marching In. And soon the entire street was singing along in an emotional chorus that rose to the heavens like a prayer of gratitude. As Richard placed the ring on Emily's finger, she whispered in his ear, You know what I love most about this whole story. What? He asked, his green eyes shining with emotion. That it started with $1 million tip. But what brought us here didn't cost anything. It was just love, patience, and courage to change. And coffee. Don't forget the coffee, he joked. And coffee, she agreed, laughing. Always the coffee. Sophie, emotional to the bone, but not missing the opportunity to be the provocative younger sister, shouted from the crowd, Hey, you two! Don't forget that I come first. I need to finish medical school. The general laughter was so loud that it startled the mockingbirds resting on the electric wires. As the party continued into the night, with guitar, trumpet, and lots of good conversation, Emily and Richard sat on the cafe's veranda, watching their two families, blood and chosen, celebrate together. Do you regret it? Asked Emily, playing with the new ring. Meeting you? Never. No, silly, leaving that $1 million tip. If we think about it, it was the value of our marriage divided by the months of dating. Comes out quite expensive. Richard laughed, pulling her closer. Best investment of my life. The return has been infinite. They stayed there, watching the stars appear one by one in the Louisiana sky, listening to the distant river and the laughter of friends. 2 years ago, they were two strangers carrying different pains. Now they were two people who had learned that true love isn't about becoming perfect for someone, but about being loved despite the imperfections and loving back with the same intensity. "What are we going to do with the rest of the money?" asked Richard. Emily had used only $200,000 to open the cafe and create the educational fund. "I was thinking of expanding, opening other community cafes in underprivileged neighborhoods, one in each major city of the South to start." Her eyes sparkled with the excitement of the project. "Imagine a network of cafes that isn't just business, it's social transformation." "I know some investors who might be interested in a project like this," said Richard with a mischievous smile. "The CEO of Blackwood Holdings. For example." "Oh, really? And you have contacts with this guy?" she joked. "I have a meeting with him tomorrow morning. Actually, every morning when I look in the mirror." They laughed, and the sound mixed with the music still playing downstairs, with the sound of the waves and with the smell of coffee that would always be present in their lives as a reminder of where everything began. And so, on a veranda in New Orleans, while the Mississippi River reflected the full moon, two people who had found each other through a cup of coffee wrote the next chapter of a story that proved that sometimes happy endings are just new beginnings in disguise. 5 years had passed since that rainy afternoon when Richard left an envelope with $1 million on a cafe table. Sophie's Cafe had become an urban legend in New Orleans, and the Emily and Richard Community Cafe Network was already operating in 12 cities across the South, each one adapted to the local culture, each one transforming lives. Emily, now Emily Wilson Blackwood, she kept Wilson in the middle, proud of her origins, was 6 months pregnant with twins, a boy and a girl who already had names chosen: Joseph, in honor of the grandfather who had taught about coffee and friendship, and Martha, in honor of the grandmother of the cake recipes. Richard had sold much of his traditional businesses to dedicate himself entirely to social projects. The transformation wasn't just in what he did, but in who he had become. A man who smiled easily, who knew by name each employee of each cafe, who spent Saturdays playing football with the neighborhood boys and Sundays cooking with Emily. Sophie had graduated as a doctor with honors and was now doing her residency in pediatrics at the same hospital where she had interned. She was dating a young architect she had met at the cafe. He designed affordable housing. She cared for the health of children. Love seemed to be contagious in that family. On a Sunday morning, as they prepared lunch together in the kitchen of their home in Lakeview, a simple house with a large yard where they grew their own coffee beans, Emily looked at Richard peeling a squash and thought about how life can be surprising. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, intercepting her gaze. "About how a tip changed 2 lives." "No," he corrected, putting down the knife and approaching to kiss her forehead. "What changed our lives was your courage to be genuine in a world of masks. And my luck to have found someone who didn't give up on me when I deserved to be given up on." Emily smiled, placing her hands on her belly where their children were growing. "Do you think they'll understand our story when they grow up?" "They'll live an even better one," replied Richard, embracing her from behind and feeling the babies move. "Because they'll grow up knowing that true love exists, that transformation is possible, and that sometimes the best things in life begin with a simple cup of coffee." And so, in a simple kitchen in New Orleans, surrounded by the aroma of coffee and Cajun spices, two people who met through kindness and second chances continued to write a love story that proved that sometimes life's miracles begin in the most common places, with the simplest gestures, and transform into something extraordinary when touched by the courage to truly love. 10 years later, the legacy continues. The Grand Hall of the Louisiana State Capitol was filled with authorities, social entrepreneurs, and journalists from all over the country. It was the ceremony for the National Social Entrepreneurship Award, and Emily Wilson Blackwood, at 37, was walking toward the stage to receive the highest honor of her career. Her blonde hair, now cut in an elegant long bob, swayed gently as she climbed the marble steps. She wore a navy blue tailored suit that Sophie had insisted on buying for the occasion. "You can't receive a national award in jeans, sis." The auditorium rose in warm applause when her name was announced. Richard, in the front row, firmly held the hands of Joseph and Martha, now 4 years old. The boy, an exact copy of his father with his blonde hair and curious green eyes, swung his little legs in the chair, while the girl, who had inherited her mother's crystal blue eyes, observed everything with the concentration of a little philosopher. "Daddy, why is everyone clapping for Mommy?" whispered Martha. "Because your mother did something very special." "Princess, she helped many people realize their dreams," replied Richard, his green eyes shining with pride. The Sophie's Cafe network had become a national phenomenon. 28 units spread across the United States, each generating an average of 25 direct jobs and positively impacting more than 500 families per region. More than 10,000 young people had benefited from the educational programs, and 156 micro-entrepreneurs had received credit and mentoring to open their own businesses. But the numbers, however impressive they were, didn't tell the whole story. There was Mary Bowman, 45, who learned to read in the literacy program at the Memphis Cafe, and now wrote poetry that she published on a blog with thousands of followers. There was Robert, a former homeless man from Atlanta who had become the best barista in the unit and created his own specialty coffee brand. There was little Jasmine, 8 years old, daughter of an employee at the Nashville Cafe, who had won a full scholarship to a private school after her teachers discovered her talent for mathematics. Emily reached the microphone and waited for silence. When she spoke, her voice echoed clear and firm throughout the hall. "Honorable Governor, ladies and gentlemen, I want to begin this speech with a confession. 10 years ago, I was just a waitress serving coffee in a small establishment in the French Quarter." A murmur of surprise ran through the auditorium. Few knew the true details of her origin. "I earned minimum wage, worked 2 jobs to support my younger sister, and dreamed of one day having my own business. But what I couldn't imagine was that my life would completely change because of a tip, $1 million tip." The silence in the hall was absolute. Emily took a deep breath and continued. "That amount could have been used to solve personal problems, to buy material goods, to ensure comfort. But I learned that money without purpose is just paper. The true value of that tip wasn't in the zeros of the amount, but in the opportunity it represented." She paused, looking for Richard in the audience. Their eyes met, and he nodded discreetly, encouraging her. "Today, 10 years later, I can say that that tip has multiplied in ways I never imagined. Not just financially, but in transformed lives, in realized dreams, in renewed hope. Each cafe we open is the fruit not only of the initial investment, but of the care, sweat, and dedication of hundreds of people who believed in this collective dream." The applause began spontaneously, but she raised her hand, asking for silence. "This award isn't mine. It belongs to each employee who woke up early to serve the perfect coffee. It belongs to each customer who chose to support our project. It belongs to each young person who studied in our community libraries. It belongs to each family that got an opportunity through our programs." She looked directly at the camera that was broadcasting the event live. "And it especially belongs to someone who taught me that the greatest life lessons sometimes begin with the simplest gestures. Someone who entered my life testing my patience, but ended up testing my heart. And who showed me that it's possible to change, grow, and become a better version of ourselves." In the auditorium, discreet tears rolled down various faces. Sophie, seated in the second row next to her husband Lucas and their two small children, wiped her eyes without caring about her makeup. I accept this award on behalf of all who believe that social entrepreneurship isn't charity, it's justice. It's not giving the fish, it's teaching to fish and ensuring that everyone has access to the river. Thank you. The ovation was deafening. Emily descended from the stage and was immediately enveloped in the arms of her family. Joseph and Martha covered her with kisses, while Richard embraced her with an intensity that spoke of years of growing admiration. "Famous Mommy!" shouted Joseph, making everyone laugh. "No, my love. Mommy just did what she had to do," Emily corrected, kneeling to be at the height of her children. The cocktail party after the ceremony was an exciting celebration. Employees from various cafes in the network had traveled especially to be present. Emily circulated among everyone, greeting, thanking, listening to stories of personal transformation that reminded her why she had chosen this path. It was when she approached a familiar group in the corner of the hall that she felt her heart race. An elegant woman of about 60, well-groomed grey hair and familiar green eyes, was animatedly conversing with Sophie. "Emily," said Sophie with a mischievous smile, "I want to introduce you to someone very special. This is Elizabeth Blackwood, Richard's aunt." The world seemed to stop for a second. Emily knew that Richard's mother had died when he was a child, but this was his aunt, his father's sister, who had distanced herself from the family after disagreements about the direction of the business. Richard had reconciled with her 2 years ago, and now she was a constant presence in the grandchildren's lives. "Aunt Beth," said Richard, approaching the group with the children. "See, I wasn't exaggerating when I said my wife was extraordinary." Elizabeth smiled warmly at Emily. "My dear, I've been following your work for years. What you've built is absolutely inspiring. August, my brother, was brilliant in business, but you two have achieved something he never did, turning money into genuine happiness." "Thank you, Mrs. Blackwood. That means a lot," replied Emily, immediately feeling at ease with the woman. "Call me Aunt Beth, please. After all, you gave me the most beautiful grandchildren in the world." She knelt to hug Joseph and Martha. "And besides, you transformed my nephew into a completely different man. The Richard I know today is someone my brother would have liked to have known." Later that night, after putting the twins to bed in their hotel room, Emily and Richard sat on the balcony overlooking the Mississippi River. The full moon reflected on the dark water, creating a silver trail that seemed to connect heaven to the river. "What are you thinking about?" asked Richard, noticing that she was quieter than usual. "About how surreal life is sometimes. 10 years ago I was cleaning tables in the French Quarter, worried about how I was going to pay the bills for the month. Today I received the highest social entrepreneurship award in the country." She nestled against his chest. "It seems like a dream I'll wake up from at any moment, and if it's a dream, let's dream together forever," he said, kissing the top of her head. "But can I tell you a secret?" "Of course." "That $1 million tip? Actually, it was the cheapest thing I've ever bought in my life." "How so?" "Because in exchange for it, I got you. I got our family. I got a real purpose. I got the chance to be someone my children can be proud of." He turned her to look her in the eyes. $1 million for a lifetime of happiness. It was practically free." Emily laughed, that crystalline laugh that continued to be her trademark. "You've always been bad at math, businessman." "Maybe, but I'm an expert in long-term investments." They stayed there until late hours, planning the future, talking about the possibility of expanding to other countries, about how to create an educational program that could be replicated in other companies, about the dreams they had for Joseph and Martha. "Do you think they'll want to follow in our footsteps?" asked Emily. "I don't know, and it doesn't matter. I just want them to be happy and to remember that small gestures can have big impacts." "And that coffee always solves everything," she joked. "And that coffee always solves everything," he agreed, sealing the joke with a soft kiss. The next day, before returning home, they made a point of visiting the original cafe in the French Quarter. It was Sunday, but they had arranged with the local team to open especially for them. The place was exactly as Emily remembered, but at the same time completely transformed. The corner table, Richard's table, now had a small plaque. "Table of Inspiration. Here was born a story of love and transformation." Emily laughed when she saw it. "The employee's idea," explained Marianne, the local manager. "Customers love knowing the story." They sat right there, at that table loaded with memories, while the twins played in the small kids' space that had been created. Emily ordered 2 coffees, prepared exactly as they used to drink 10 years ago. "If someone had told me that first afternoon that you would return years later as my husband and the father of my children, I would have sent the person to a psychiatrist," commented Emily. "And if someone had told me that the waitress who served me coffee with a genuine smile would become the most important woman in my life, I would have bought her cafe forever," replied Richard. Joseph ran to them at that moment. "Daddy, Mommy, did you meet here?" "Yes, we did, my love," replied Emily. "And did you become friends right away?" Richard and Emily exchanged an amused look. "Not exactly, son. Your daddy was a bit grumpy at first." "A bit?" Richard protested dramatically. "I was extremely grumpy. A true professional grump." The children laughed, and Martha asked, "But now you're happy forever?" "Forever and ever," replied Emily, taking Richard's hand on the table. And so, on a sunny Sunday morning in the French Quarter, while the bell of the neighboring church rang melodiously and the familiar aroma of coffee spread through the air, a family silently celebrated an extraordinary journey that began with distrust and blossomed into love, dedication, and purpose. The $1,000,000 tip had transformed into something much greater, a legacy of transformation that would continue to impact lives for generations. And all because, on just any afternoon, a waitress chose to smile at a grumpy customer and a wounded man chose to believe that change was possible.